According to the Sydney Morning Herald today, the Greens are demanding a $250 million Truth and Justice Commission if Labor wins the next election. And don't forget, if Labor do win the next election, it will be with the Greens. This Truth and Justice Commission is supposedly designed to oversee an Indigenous truth-telling process. Now, I'm all in favour of people learning and telling the truth, but forgive me if I'm a little cynical when it comes to the Greens being in charge of what no doubt they would call their truth, as opposed to the truth. Personally, I would love to know, and would love all of our children to know, the real historical truths, not the political dogma, of the history of Indigenous Australians. Warts and all, the good, the bad and the ugly. The tragic suffering of individuals as well as the extraordinary achievements of Indigenous individuals. In particular, let's learn about the unsung Indigenous heroes of Australia, who we either never knew about or who have in today's woke world of cancel culture and left-wing censorship gone out of fashion or been silenced, erased from our history. The Indigenous Australians who on Australia Day, the day after tomorrow, we should be acknowledging for their role in building modern Australia. A couple of years ago, Fox in the US ran a fascinating series that looked at many of the unsung heroes of African American history, going right back to the foundation of that nation. The show was called America's Black Founders. Here's just a little snippet of it.
How about the painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware? Bunch of white guys, right? No. Look here. African American, helping row the boat across. You know what his name was? Prince Whipple. He fought alongside Washington during the Revolution. Take a look at this one, this painting of, this is the Marquis de Lafayette. If you look at this, you just think, oh yeah, and then he made his slave dress up like I don't know what. But that's what you would think, right? This guy is incredibly important. This guy may have won the Revolutionary War. James Armistead was his name.
Now, Australia never fought a revolutionary war with Great Britain, but this nation of ours, one of the most successful multiracial, if not the most successful multiracial nation on earth, was built on the back of the sweat and toil and sacrifices of not only white settlers and farmers, but just as significantly post-war immigrants, the sacrifices of the Anzacs, those who resolved to flee totalitarian atrocities in Asia and elsewhere around the world, and of course, the personal sacrifices, dreams, the struggles against adversity, the aspirations of so many Indigenous Australians. Many Indigenous Australians were proud patriots of this country for over 200 years who helped create this nation. Let's hear the truth about their lives, their choices, not just the victimhood ideology endlessly peddled by the Greens and Labor in cahoots with Get Up and the ABC and all our schools or universities. The Centre for Independent Studies has done a great job with an online series of posts by Nyungai Warren Mundine called Talking Truth, in which Warren highlights and tells the stories of great Indigenous historical figures, such as Eric Diral, MLA, a member of the Gamai clan who became the first ever Indigenous member of the Queensland Parliament in the 1970s. Or, of course, Neville Bonner, AO, a Liberal Party member, yes, a Liberal Party member, and Indigenous Australia, who was elected to Parliament only 4 years after the 1967 referendum. What about Hyacinth Tunga Talum of the Tiwi people, the first Indigenous Australian in the Northern Territory Parliament? And of course, Lionel Rose, the great boxer, the great Australian boxer who said, "I think of myself as an Australian. I don't go in for all this black and white thing. To me, we're all Australians." Now, these are just some of the Indigenous men and women, the great Indigenous men and women we need to celebrate for their personal sacrifices, their passions, their achievements, their struggles in bringing all Australians together, regardless of the colour of the skin, regardless of their advantages or disadvantages, regardless of their privileges or their sufferings. And I urge you, visit the CIS website, cis.org.au, or even subscribe to and support the CIS, where proud and talented Indigenous Australians like Rowan Dean, like the great Jacinta Price, are doing such excellent work bringing Indigenous Australian history and stories and values to light. But instead of those uplifting true stories, the left in Australia have wallowed in half-truths and fantasies. The work of Bruce Pascoe, for example, which forms the basis of what many young Australians today believe to be the truth about Aboriginal history. This notion of Indigenous Australians living in towns in some agrarian society, which has repeatedly been challenged and debunked and disputed by serious scholars, even scholars normally of the left. Peter Sutton, for example, one of Australia's leading anthropologists last year, controversially called out many of the claims made by Pascoe in his best-selling Dark Emu book as being unfounded. Yet the basic thesis is still being peddled and worse, believed within our education system. If we can't trust the left to correct the mistruths or distortions, or even miscorrect outright porkies, how on earth could we ever trust them to actually discover the real truth, the truth? Yes, I'm all for a truth commission, terrific, but if Australian taxpayers are spending their $250 million, can we please have some honest answers to these simple questions? How many Indigenous Australians believe their ancestors' lives were enriched or improved due to the colonisation of Australia by the British? How many Indigenous Australians over the last 2 centuries overcame the social and racial prejudices and disadvantages of the time to build meaningful and fulfilling and positive lives for themselves and their children as proud Australians? What would have been the fate of Indigenous Australians if the continent had not been colonised by the British? What does reconciliation, a great catchphrase, but what does it actually mean? What does reconciliation look like? Yes, there has been immense suffering and wrongdoing in our history. Nobody denies that, and we must never forget that. But until the difficult and politically unpalatable questions are faced up to, we are only kidding ourselves if we think we are seeking the truth.